Hi, my name is Vincent Danen. I'm the VP of Product Security at Red Hat. I've been involved in open source security for almost 25 years. I've been at Red Hat for 16. I was at Mandriva for 8 years prior to that, if anyone's familiar with Mandriva. I've been on a number of upstream open source security teams, PHP, WebKit, a number of others. I created my own Linux distro, OpenBSD-like, worked on it for 5 years. Had a number of users, no payers. So after 5 years, I was like, I learned enough. Time to move on and spend some time with the family, right? I say all of that because I have an extensive experience with open source and open source security. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to all of you about today was some of the differences and similarities when it comes to open source software and proprietary software, particularly in the area of risk acceptance when it comes to security vulnerabilities. Now, we know that security has been top of mind across a number of industries over the last few years, probably a decade, but really ramping up maybe the last 5 years. We have new regulatory frameworks that software vendors are being required to adhere to across all industries, whether it's telco, financial services, automotive, governments. I know this room has held a lot of CRA talk yesterday, so we're seeing a lot of this stuff, AI regulations, et cetera. And we continue to see a rise in supply chain attacks and data breaches, right? Many of them continue to make huge headlines, sometimes on a daily basis. And we know that there are a lot of eyes on security right now, particularly when it comes to open source, right? I'm also going to make the assertion that I think open source today is getting the short end of the stick when it comes to that observability and those eyeballs looking at security. I'm going to get into a few details and some statistics, so bear with me a bit as I kind of go back before I go forward. So in the first 5 years that the CV program existed, the annual numbers of new CVs grew exponentially. And that can be easily attributed to a lot of new vendors adopting CVE and the program capturing more data on vulnerabilities. And then over the next decade, it increased by about 40%. And then it stayed relatively steady until about 2017. But then we saw another 125% increase in reported CVs, which then increased another 50% over the next 6 years. And then last year, we saw the largest increase we've ever seen in a 1-year period. Now, this can be attributed predominantly to the rapid development of software, right? More software means more vulnerabilities. And last year's growth was driven heavily by the Linux kernel assigning a lot of CVs. Now, CV continues to be that dominant means of representing vulnerabilities in software, but we know it's not perfect, right? There are things that are not security issues that get CV names, and there are vulnerabilities that don't get CV names either. And if CVE becomes even more widely adopted, one example is the mobile application space, where we don't see a lot of CVEs. We could see another explosion in the number of CVEs that we see on an annual basis. Now, what's critical to be aware of is that the guidance in 1999 to security practitioners was to patch everything. That guidance today, 25 years later, has not changed. And in under 25 years, the number of CVEs has increased by a rather astonishing 4,400% comparing 1999 to 2024. Now, the number of vulnerabilities that we see are an indicator, but they're not necessarily an indicator of compromise, nor are they an indicator of potential compromise, right? They're just a data point. We have to recognize that not all vulnerabilities matter, not all vulnerabilities get exploited or will even attempt to be exploited, and not all vulnerabilities, if they are exploited, actually lead to a compromise. There's a real data point that we have to pay attention to, and that is software exploitation. So CISA, the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, makes available a known exploited vulnerabilities database that alerts to proven exploitation of software in the wild, and then ties that back to CVs. Now, using that database, we can see that exploitation grows year over year, like the number of CVEs does, but nowhere near the same extent as the number of CVs overall. And when we look at risk, the number of vulnerabilities is a useful metric, I guess, but it actually isn't that useful. As one example, in 2005, there were just under 5,000 CVs reported, with only one known to be exploited. But not everyone who used that software was exploited, including those who used that vulnerable version. There's a slew of other factors that determine whether or not you may be a victim to these sorts of attacks, right? Network topology, other security technologies such as firewalls, basically where the software lived and what the software did. And those are all very important considerations that we tend not to take into account. So even then, while the number of CVs over that 25-year period grew at a ridiculous rate, the amount of available software grew as well. Mike mentioned Kubernetes. That is a beast of a lot of different pieces of software, right? And that's relatively recent. And yet, despite all of that growth, exploitation rates stayed relatively steady. You can see that it has always been less than 1% of known vulnerabilities are ever exploited, and an even smaller percentage of companies or individuals get compromised by those globally. So this means that the odds of successful exploitation against a company using a software vulnerability are vanishingly small. Now, it's easy to focus on technology to look for fixes, right? We make a very convenient scapegoat. But the real things to think about are pretty clear when you look at the sources of these breaches. Now, Verizon annually publishes a really nice data breach investigations report, and it shows that breaches through software exploitation tend to be single-digit events. Now, exploitation through people and process, those are the sources of the vast majority of breaches. So think phishing, spoofing, misconfigurations is a huge one, weak passwords, and so forth. And I personally also put the lack of patching, when patches are available, squarely into that people and process bucket, because it certainly isn't a technology problem. So let's take a look at the Verizon report that they published 3 years ago. Even though they noted that exploited vulnerabilities were up compared to previous years, the number of breaches caused by exploited software continues to be quite small. In 2023, that was about 7% of breaches were due to an exploited software vulnerability. And the 2023 report actually showed a decline, and that number was 5%. Now, in all fairness, the 2024 report was higher at 15%, but that was driven by the highly exploited MOVEit vulnerability. I'm sure you're all aware of it. And incidentally, I like to point out, because I'm an open source practitioner, MOVEit is proprietary software. So the largest contributors to breaches continue to be stolen credentials, business email compromise, phishing campaigns, and improperly configured software, or what I like to refer to as the human exploitation versus software exploitation. Those are all the top contributors to a successful breach. Now, I kept the 2022 report mentioned because of this particular illustration, which I really like. Most attackers perform scans for weaknesses against IPs and open ports, and of those scans, a smaller subset will demonstrate a potential weakness, a smaller number of which are actual vulnerabilities. And of those that are actual vulnerabilities in software, an even smaller subset permit remote code execution, which is where we see breaches starting to happen. Now, less than 1% of what gets scanned yields remote code execution. And again, in 2022, that represented roughly 7% of successful breaches. Now, it illustrates a few primary considerations. First, the weakest element is always the human element. Someone clicked something that they shouldn't have or believed something that they shouldn't have. Second, proper configuration and hardening of software post-deployment is key. And finally, it's common knowledge that good security is best when it's built up of multiple layers. Think monitoring and detection, security education, firewalls, and physical security, just to name a few. Patching software is one layer, but it's a statistically insignificant one at that. But ironically, it's also the one that gets the most attention, especially when it comes to open source. But that's a bit of a red herring because a lot of proprietary software these days also includes open source. So the 2025 Black Duck Open Source Security and Risk Analysis Report scanned about 1,600 code bases last year, and it showed that 97% of what they scanned contained some open source, and that 70% of all code originated from open source. Now, I can't get into all the details of the report, but it's very interesting. I highly encourage you to read it if you haven't already. And also, incidentally, if anyone has doubted that open source has won and is not just widely used, doubt no longer. It's also widely accepted, right? Which is great. The software development rules changed. Open source is not that outlier that it used to be anymore. But the software risk assessment rules haven't changed. So what do I mean by that? Well, open source by its very nature is open, right? The code is open, reporting is open, bugs are visible. This means that security relevant bugs are easy enough to find, and it very much means that the emperor has no clothes. Everything is visible. But it also means that anything that looks remotely like a security issue, no matter how improbable or unlikely it is to cause any kind of damage, is labeled as a security issue. Well, why? Because transparency is a core tenet to open source. It's not possible to hide something, so we call it for what it is. And this is why you see so many vulnerabilities in open source spread across a variety of impacts, and they tend to land in that lower half. The industry typically rates severity impact by critical, important or high, moderate or medium, and low. And most open source vulnerabilities tend to float in that moderate range. And when we talk about impact ratings, we mean the impact of successful exploitation and the conditions to exploit. Right? So a critical vulnerability is one that is very easy to exploit and also yields high privileges. So think remote code execution by an unauthenticated user. An important rating would be given to an issue with basically the same yield, the same impact, but it's more difficult to exploit. Maybe you need to be local rather than remote, or it requires some kind of authentication. Now, moderate issues are those that are even harder to exploit, require unlikely configurations or misconfigurations, and would yield less impact to confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And then finally, low issues are those that yield minimal consequences and require some really unlikely configurations or circumstances. Personally, I just like to call lows regular bugs. So if you're here and you've dealt with CVSS, like I'm sure that all of you have, you can also see here a part of the CVSS user guide that proves that the industry has been using CVSS wrong pretty much since its inception, right? CVSS base scores do not measure risk. Thank you. There's a round of applause for that one, right? CVSS does not measure risk. It's a prioritization mechanism so that you know if you have a dozen vulnerabilities, which one should you be addressing first? CVSS is a fantastic guide when it's used correctly. But unfortunately, most people and software do not use it correctly. So let's take a look at some real data. Now, Red Hat, as an enterprise open source vendor, does not hide vulnerabilities, and we are very transparent with our data. Every year we publish a risk report that Krob is very happy he doesn't have to work on anymore. And that goes into a lot of detail and what we saw and dealt with during that year. Now, these are preliminary numbers. The report's going to be published, I'm told, next week. So you'll be able to see all the gory details then, but the good stuff is here. And these numbers tell us a few important things, right? And I believe that you cannot call any software totally secure, but I do believe that this demonstrates that open source is trustworthy. Now, it also highlights that while there might be a lot of CVEs in open source, most of them do not get actively exploited. So for an enterprise open source vendor like Red Hat, where our customers depend on us for stability, it doesn't make sense to patch everything. As one example, we had over 2,500 CVEs that we rated moderate last year, and not one of them is known to be exploited. Not one. It also highlights the ramifications of the Linux kernel becoming a CNA. The total number of vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel that we had represented here are 2,760, which also represents 69% of all the vulnerabilities affecting all of our products. It also contributed to the 138% increase in CVEs affecting all of Red Hat's products between 2023 and 2024. Now, as a frame of reference, I looked back in 2023, only 11.3% of those CVEs were in the Linux kernel. So thank you, upstream. Okay, not to dig on the Linux kernel, I love the Linux kernel. But what about proprietary software, right? Now, I'm not going to name names, but this is public data provided by a major proprietary vendor. And you'll also note that on the previous slide, I used the word discovered, and here I'm using the word reported for a very specific reason that I'll get to in a moment. Now, looking at CVEs with a release date in 2024, there are some striking differences from the Red Hat risk report. First, they had reported 1,397 vulnerabilities as affecting them, yet only 1,121 had a severity rating. Now, this vendor uses the exact same 4-point rating scale that we do, so I find that omission curious and interesting. Now, on the surface, both exploitation rates are quite low, although their exploitation rate is much higher amongst moderate issues and is quite low on those higher rated vulnerabilities. And the overall exploitation rate is significantly higher than Red Hat's, although there are much less total vulnerabilities. But I think that there's a better way that we can kind of compare and contrast the two. But when we look at the overall weight of vulnerability ratings, I think there are two things that we have to keep in mind, right? One is that ratings are pretty objective and consistent. So if you have an easily exploitable vulnerability that results in arbitrary code execution without authentication, every single vendor is going to call that critical. If you have a temporary file erase condition that requires shell access, pretty much every vendor is going to call that low. Second, the use of that software and thus the resulting impact might be different, right? So you might see the same CVE rated differently in different products. Red Hat does this often. Using us as an example, we may have the same component in Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and it might be rated higher than that same component used in Red Hat OpenShift. So for RHEL, because it's an operating system, we literally have no idea how that specific component might be used. So we look at it from the worst case scenario. In OpenShift, however, that component might be used in a very specific way that no user or no attacker can actually get to, and it's used in a non-vulnerable way. So we're going to rate it lower because it's effectively internal plumbing. There's no path to execution. Nobody can tamper with it. It literally doesn't matter. Now, that distinction is important because I'm going to probably guess here that even given a fairly wide margin of error, there should be some consistency across the board in terms of the number of critical vulnerabilities in the ecosystem to the number of moderate and low vulnerabilities in the ecosystem, unless we have some very terrible go big or go home type developers who like to create these monstrous security issues. But as you can see here, comparing Red Hat to this proprietary vendor, the numbers are inverted. We had less than 1/4% of our total vulnerabilities discovered that we rated critical, and this vendor had 28 times that, which were rated critical. We had less than 8% rated important, and this vendor had nearly 88% rated the same way. The bulk of the open source vulnerabilities in our products, or 92%, are rated moderate and low. And this vendor had a very, very small 5.5% of their vulnerabilities rated moderate and low. And what's even more curious is that out of the 62 vulnerabilities that this vendor reported as moderate and low, 41 of them were actually in open source components and publicly known as a result. And as a side note, despite the increased kernel CVEs, the overall weighting comparing the two was virtually unchanged when I did the same comparison last year for 2023. So the only logical conclusion that at least I can infer here is that not only did the software development rules change, the security reporting rules changed as well. Now, remember that I said that Red Hat had discovered 4,272 vulnerabilities affecting our products, and 1,397 vulnerabilities were reported by this proprietary vendor. Now, proprietary software by its very nature is opaque. You can't see the code, and if a vulnerability exists, the only way you're going to know about it is if somebody tells you. You can't discover it by looking at the source code that you don't have access to. You can't even quickly determine if a bug that you find is security relevant without sometimes significant effort. But that doesn't mean that those vulnerabilities aren't there. Now, most proprietary vendors will tell you about the critical and important issues because they're the easiest to find, the easiest to exploit, and they're the ones that cause the most damage. And they rightly, in my opinion, ignore the moderate and low issues, either by not giving them a CVE in public when they fix them, or probably by not fixing them at all. So this has two impacts, right? First, it lowers the total number of vulnerabilities, which maybe amplifies the look how secure we are messaging that PR teams love to throw out there. But then second, as the end user, you can't mitigate what you don't know about. Now, open source's transparency is more this might be a little contentious, a problem for a compliance auditor than it is for real security, right? It means that you will have vulnerabilities that show up on a checklist and you might not be able to tick that box. And that's okay. This is where actual risk assessments come into play. And it affords advantages, right? You can mitigate without patching software if you know about it and you know how it may be exposed. If there are no mitigations and it's truly impactful due to your use of it, you can approach your vendor, assuming that you're paying for it, for a fix, or you can simply rip it out and replace it with something else that you're more comfortable with, right? You have options. Now, the most important takeaway here is that proprietary vendors are under no obligation to tell you that they have found vulnerabilities, and there are few ways, if any, to hold them accountable. They will inform you of those that are truly risky to help customers avoid significant risk, and the rest they will admit to if a security researcher finds it and discloses it publicly. Thank you, Black Hat and DEFCON. Now, I believe that proprietary vendors want to protect their customers from meaningful security issues. Now, open source does not have the luxury, perhaps, if we want to call it that, of not informing end users about security issues. They are open and will always be public. And this means that we have to be comfortable with explicitly accepting known lower severity risk in open source because you're already accepting unknown lower severity risk from proprietary vendors implicitly. And it doesn't make sense to judge the open and transparent more harshly than the closed and opaque. And yet that happens every single day. Now, proper risk assessments mean looking beyond a list of CVs. Most vulnerability scanners will tell you that they have this covered. And in deference to the wonderful vendors who supported our conference today, I don't want to be too harsh, but I don't think they do a very good job. I'm not being too harsh. Very few take, with the notable exception of some of the vendors I saw this week, that actually are doing some very novel, intelligent risk assessments with scanning. But very few take those applications, your environment, and your use of that software into account. Many end up reporting just a lot of noise without applying any intelligence or remediation suggestions beyond the old get a patch. And most, very aggravatingly, tend to equate CVSS base scores provided by the NVD with risk, and most tend to ignore vendor-provided data. And that volume has only gotten bigger and noisier with containerized deployments, where your infrastructure can have hundreds of containers affected by the same CVE, and we're counting that CVE over and over and over again. Now, I'm personally looking forward to potentially the use of AI in this space to maybe help better surface real risk to end users. If our goal is risk reduction, which it should be, then we need to realize that what we're doing actually isn't working. If 80% of our security budgets and tools are being spent to find software vulnerabilities that don't get exploited, rather than solving the human element where 80% of the breaches we see happen, then our priorities are wrong, and we're going to continue to see more breaches, more data exfiltration, more customer data misused, and more ransomware demands. Proper risk assessments, actually assessing risk and mitigating what is most impactful and most probable, right? Proper risk assessment is not known vulnerabilities. That is a game that we are losing, and it is only going to get worse. There is a cost to chasing that known vulnerabilities dream, and it is very, very high. Now, a proper risk assessment will tell you that you can ignore tar in a container unless you're actually untarring untrusted input from remote users, right? Otherwise, it's meaningless. It's going to tell you that you can ignore kernel driver CVEs for hardware that you don't even run in your environment and are only exposed to on a container platform if properly configured would require a high level of privilege to access or exploit anyways. And if an attacker already has that privilege, then they don't need to exploit USB traffic or load a wireless driver to get it. They've already got it. And that's why Red Hat, at least, and I know a number of other vendors as well, focus on those critical and important vulnerabilities across all of our products. And we treat any moderate or low that becomes actively exploited in the wild as a critical, and we're going to get a fix out right away because then it's actually meaningful. If we go back to those earlier numbers from last year, that's 0 vulnerabilities out of over 3,900 moderates and lows. That's 3,900 vulnerabilities where we're not introducing code changes that could have other impacts to a customer environment. And it's 3,900 that our customers don't have to test and upgrade. Now, in 2023, there were 3 vulnerabilities and over 1,300 that were known to be exploited. Those are the impactful ones. And since we're talking about exploitation and risk, can anyone tell me what's wrong with this alert that CISA released in September of last year? Sorry? Adobe Flash? Mic drop, maybe, yes. On the one hand, it, is 10 years to widely exploit a Flash vulnerability is interesting because those did tend to be exploited pretty quickly. Persistent, yes. But the real problem is that Flash went end of life in 2020, over 4 years ago. So since CISA's audience is primarily the US government, we can assume that they saw exploitation of 4 10-year-old vulnerabilities in a product that no one should have been using for the last 5 years. That's a problem. And this is why software life cycles matter more than you think. When someone complains to me about wanting fixes for low-rated vulnerabilities in a currently supported product, and then I find out they're still using RHEL 4, which went end of life 8 years ago, I have a really hard time in believing them when they say security matters and that low-rated vulnerability is impactful to you. I have a really hard time. So old, unsupported software is like Swiss cheese, right? Full of holes. Now, don't think that you can avoid large upgrades by demanding smaller incremental patches. Generally speaking, keeping software up to date within vendor-supported cycles will dramatically reduce your risk. And that means when you're planning your IT lifecycle, you have to consider when what you're using actually goes end of life, and then have plans to upgrade and not just patch. And this is particularly true when it comes to software exploitation, but it's not just software by any means. And I think, Mike, you mentioned that a little bit in your last presentation.
Cheese there is great. Right up the road.
Cheese is great. The analogy is not so much. Does anyone remember Spectre Meltdown? Right? It was a novel, never seen before type of vulnerability made public in early 2018. Now, Red Hat had 2 months to prepare, much longer than our standard 2-week embargo, and we needed that time. Chrome still has PTSD, I'm sure. So do I. The cost to deliver 20 kernels to fix the issue was well over 8,000 people hours. We had weekly calls with Intel. We had daily calls across the organization, including support and legal. Performance engineering was involved to ensure that we didn't impact performance too much. Now, obviously, not every vulnerability is this dramatic or this expensive, but all of this time focused on remediating Spectre Meltdown was time that wasn't spent on other potentially more impactful things. And as an aside, while they have found weaponized exploit code to take advantage of this attack, I have not personally seen or heard of any evidence that anyone was ever actually exploited by it. And it took 3 years for the first fully weaponized Spectre exploit to be discovered. Now, this article was published in March of 2021 by Recorded Future, which is a pretty reputable source of exploit information. And this security researcher tweeted shortly after it was first made public in 2018 that the fix was worse than the problem. In fact, while we worked really hard to neutralize the exploitable code, the only real fix was to disable simultaneous multithread, or SMT. And if you're familiar with modern CPUs, they're made up of multiple cores and threads that allow you to enable tasks that can be run in parallel, leading to faster execution, or in layman's terms, more threads, better performance. Turning off SMT negates all that benefit, and with cloud computing, makes these tasks slower and more expensive. So the cure is worse than the disease, right? Sometimes fixing a vulnerability will introduce a new vulnerability that is now unknown, or creates another problem that has a more severe impact on your business. This is no different than any other software update, including a notable issue that struck some Windows systems last year. And a more recent example, also last year, but iPadOS 18, right? It fixed 33 CVs. It also bricked some shiny new M4 iPad Pros. Now, I'm not saying that that happened because of those security fixes, but it does highlight that risk to any software changes. And this is where we have to have that honest conversation about risk, because it's not just security risk. Some people went so far as to say that fully disabling SMT is the only real fix for most of these speculative execution attacks. And to do so, you would have to accept a potentially enormous reduction in efficiency and an increase in compute cost. So if we really, truly wanted to fix all the things, then why did nobody disable SMT? And one other example that I think highlights what I mean about transparency as a strength of open source. So back in 2001, it was found that Borland's Interbase had a hard-coded user and password that was in the code persistently for 7 years. And it was only discovered after Interbase was released as the open source Firebird database project. Now, that vulnerability existed for 7 years, and yet no one complained about it. No one complained that it wasn't fixed because nobody knew about it. And yet, as soon as it was discovered, due to becoming open source, it was fixed. Now, on one hand, it was fixed because this was a really terrible vulnerability, right? On the other, it might have existed for many more years if it wasn't for open source's advantage of transparency. So after all of this, what I want you to walk away with, all right? Well, primarily that it's complicated. Balancing risk acceptance and mitigation will always be a challenge. Open source has defined accelerated development and speed to market. Open source is broadly accepted across all industries. And yet, we apply the same standards to open source that we do to proprietary software. Even though the two are very different and in some very fundamental ways, we need to treat them differently, especially when it comes to risk awareness and tolerance. So maybe a simple analogy will work. You're sick and you get a prescription. The doctor weighs the risk of any side effects against the benefit the prescription will bring. Most people don't pay attention to these side effects and just take the medicine as per the doctor's recommendation. Some will look at the side effects, do their own research, and then usually take it anyways. The difference is that now that they know about these potential side effects. And if you're like me, you tend to be a little hypervigilant and you're looking for any signs of these side effects being realized. But more often than not, we're not affected by one of these side effects. Sometimes we are, and we have to take other medicine or maybe a trip back to the doctor. But what we don't do before taking the medicine is go back to the doctor and ask them to get rid of all the side effects or provide a guarantee that there is a 0% chance that that side effect will materialize, even the most minor ones. We don't ask for side effects to be removed when we don't know that they are there. We also don't ask for side effects to be removed when we do know that they are there. We do a risk calculation. The likely side effects are minor. We take our medicine, and usually we feel better as a result. And at the end of the day, we have to recognize that when we use proprietary software, we have always accepted unknown risk and have been okay with it. And when open source software became dominant and in many cases preferred, we misunderstood that what we had implicitly accepted before and decided that now, because we knew about it, we had to fix it. Now, I guarantee that the distribution of vulnerabilities in open and proprietary software is closer than what is being publicly disclosed, which means that there are thousands of internally known and unreported moderate and low vulnerabilities in proprietary software that we accept because we are blissfully ignorant. Even this morning, I was reading Microsoft, bunch of fixes out today. What are they? They're all criticals and importance. Adobe, more fixes out today. What are they all? Criticals and importance. Not one moderate or low amongst them. Interesting. So I don't think that governments should mandate all proprietary software become open source or that proprietary vendors must disclose every single bug. And yet that would, on the surface, be the only way to achieve a certain level of equality between the two types of software. Now, that said, I believe that there is something here about equity. Proprietary and open both have certain advantages that they leverage, yet open source's advantages are being leveraged to disadvantage it. Transparency is a major advantage, and yet that same advantage is used to penalize open source communities, users, and vendors. Now, open source has always been about empowering users, and that is no different when it comes to security. Transparency is power. And yet, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. But that responsibility is on us, the end user, to accept that open source is different and its risk needs to be assessed differently. The software procurement rules changed quite a while ago, and the software security assessment rules need to catch up. And that's what I got. So I think we have a lot of time for questions. There's got to be some. There's some contentious stuff in here. Oh, there's some in Discord. Great.
So
Okay.
there was at least a question in Discord. When you say low vulnerabilities as regular bugs, how do you account for attackers stitching together multiple medium/low vulnerabilities to cause breach as effectively as a single critical vulnerability?
I mean, you can't necessarily say that they're all irrelevant. They, like vulnerability chaining is a real thing, but at the end of that chain, you actually need something to give you that elevated privilege. Like if I'm exploiting a bunch of lows to wander my way through an environment or whatnot, you know, hopping from place to place kind of thing. At the end of the day, I still need a important vulnerability or something a little bit more meaningful to actually get what it is that I'm after. So I can exploit a bunch of stuff and just end up somewhere else and still not get anything meaningful out of it. I've not heard of a single breach based only on vulnerability chaining of moderates and lows that didn't have some other misconfiguration or something else in them, right? So that's kind of the way, I mean, I look at it as misconfigurations are probably the most damaging and important thing to be paying attention to above and beyond vulnerabilities, with the exception of those that are known to be actively exploited and those criticals and importance that are easy to exploit and get you like the maximum amount for your effort. So hopefully that answers the question. This one.
Just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. I've been told I'm a Linux diva. I really appreciate all the open source contributions. So I'm going to stand up here. And, yeah, just to play a devil's advocate though with the analogy. I know analogies are never perfect, but you know, one thing I kind of noted was it's kind of missing the adversarial aspect, and you know, the data points you showed kind of proved that maybe it's a minor you know, consideration to try to include, but just kind of wondering, you know, to that point, is there any, I guess, equitable way to look at like disclosures in open source, and I guess the visibility when, you know, attackers can kind of have that insight as well?
Yeah, I mean, that is one disadvantage of the transparency that open source provides, is that attackers can look at that vulnerability data. But I think if we look back, and we've been tracking exploitation against at least the software that Red Hat ships over the past number of years, and the exploitation rates continue to be really low, right? And so that tells me a few things. It tells me that, I mean, for one, if you're looking at like, how do I prevent a nation state from attacking me? Like, sorry, some of these countries have more money than God, so maybe it doesn't matter, right? Like nothing that you do is going to stop them if they're determined. So we got to take that one off the table, right? When it comes to the rest, they're going to be looking for the return on investment. Like if I am going to launch a campaign, I am looking for that higher payoff, right? So if I can do that through compromising a person, through social engineering, that's going to be less costly for me than it is trying to figure out how to chain a bunch of exploits together, or not a bunch of exploits, a bunch of vulnerabilities together to get that, you know, get past all of these protections. If I just have to go and trick Sally into clicking something rather than do all of this work, man, I'm going to try to trick Sally every day of the week, right? So,
Thank you.
yep, that was a good question. Thank you.
Hi, my question, you briefly mentioned risk assessments. One of my needs is to be able to develop a risk assessment that helps me talk to the person that says, well, this version is vulnerable, tell your developer to update this version. And the developer group that says, okay, yeah, but my configuration of this version is not, you know, is not exploitable, so I don't need to do that. But there's no, I'm looking for a risk assessment that can help me explain that to these two.
Yeah, that's hard because I don't think a lot of the risk assessment frameworks are being properly utilized, because I think that there is latitude in being able to explain these things. You just have to explain it in a way that they understand, right? As one example, recently I had a pen test that I haven't actually seen, so I think it's just like an SCA scan, right? Of a product that included a vulnerable version, vulnerable to a low CVE of moment.js, which is a date parsing JavaScript library, right? Customer was insistent that we upgrade it because the pen test showed it was an older version of this thing. And I'm like, unless you are actually manipulating or accepting untrusted input from a user that you're thinking is a date string, like it doesn't even matter. Like, but on the flip side, maybe something changed upstream in there, because upstream, you know, unlike a lot of maybe vendors who are like, you know, stability is important. We're not going to change things on you so that the application you're running today is going to be the same application you can run in 5 years, because we're not changing anything. But now we start changing things and those applications start to break, right? And that's what I mean when I say the risk of a code change for something low, right? It's not just that there might be a new unknown worse vulnerability that shows up, right? Because I mean, some of Red Hat software, at least in RHEL, is a little long in the tooth. It's pretty old, right? When you have a 10-year life cycle. it has been proven that there are vulnerabilities that get introduced later than that. So we have a number of customers who avoid even any kind of exposure to a CV because the software is older than that. So I posit that the longer you go, the more secure this is because you're minimizing the changes to it. But if we grab the latest version all the time, then our customers would be vulnerable to all of those things. And not only that, the applications that the customer is deploying on that might stop working. Like as one example, I wrote for myself a blog platform in Python. I don't have a lot of time to do a lot of development. So usually Christmas every year, I'm like, man, I should do like a pip upgrade, upgrade my dependencies. And then that's fast, takes me a couple minutes. And then like the rest of the day I spend fixing my code that now broke because all these dependencies changed something, right? So code change introduces risk. It may not necessarily be security risk, but I mean, it's my blog, so I don't care, but I had downtime and I was frustrated and I wasted Christmas doing it, right? Like there's a risk to my sanity, I guess. But all of these changes are there. So I think that if you can convey that as a way of like, the risk isn't just scary security thing over here, but it's like risk to business, risk to things breaking, risk to downtime, risk to whatever. Then you actually start talking about risk in its totality rather than just risk from a very small, minute security perspective.
But actually add to that, that downtime is also a security risk, right?
100%. Yep, 100%.
Security. I actually had a question. I was wondering if you think that proprietary software doesn't have or doesn't report as many low and moderate vulnerabilities because they're not being discovered or because, well, they're being known, but they're just being ignored.
So I'm speculating, right? Because I've actually never worked for a proprietary software company. So I have no idea what goes on the other side. That's the opaqueness that's there, right? What I do think is that given the large volume of moderates and lows that we see in open source, relatively minor vulnerabilities, like you can't tell me that all of these proprietary vendors have very terrible developers who make astronomically huge security issues all the time just because they don't know how to make less impactful security bugs. Like it feels like a statistical anomaly. And so if we believe that some of these low security issues that I would say are, bugs show up in proprietary software as well, because developers are developers and maybe we're all, similar skill set or whatever, right? At least on average, they have to be there. So either they're not looking for them or they look for them and fix them silently, which is totally possible. They could do that, right? Or they just don't care, right? I know I was talking to somebody, I think it was at Sauce Fusion last year. We were talking about a security vendor, like they sell security products. And the CEO basically said, we will never have a CVE ever for our product. They had security issues. They fixed security issues. They never publicly disclosed them because we're a security company and it would tarnish our reputation if we had security fixes in our own security product.
Maybe the low and moderate are actually, because they're hard to exploit, maybe they're actually not being discovered either.
It's very possible. Like if they don't, again, like whatever their SDL may or may not look like, I don't know. So they may not be looking for them, but they are present. Some of which because they're in open source, like well-known open source components. And if we go to 97% of these code bases have some open source, then I guarantee you there's some moderates and lows that are in there. But then on the flip side, right? Like when we're looking at all of these things, they could just simply not be disclosing them because they don't want their CV counts to be higher. Right, like there are a lot of reasons behind that, and I can't profess to know what they are. Like I can only speculate because I've never worked in that environment. Right, but it's a good question. Thank you.
So another question from Discord. How would you encourage low/medium security bug reporting by developers? Do we need more sticks or more carrots?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
How would you encourage low/medium security bug reporting by developers?
How would I encourage it?
Yeah.
or encourage them to fix it. Well, I think like open source communities, upstreams, they do fix them, right? Like, I don't think there's any open source projects that are like, meh, I don't care. We'll just leave those things there forever. They may dispute it as being security relevant, right? But they tend to fix them. It's the downstream use of that. So, I mean, I'll pick on Red Hat. We don't fix all the moderates and lowest because we don't grab all the latest versions from upstream. And we know that could negatively impact a customer environment. A lot of people who are pulling directly from upstream and may not want to use that later version for a variety of reasons may elect not to. So it's not that developers are not incentivized to fix them. I believe open source maintainers do really good and care and fix these things. But do we need to pull in all of those fixes every single time? Maybe not, because at the same time, they're adding all the new features and things that, that excite them about their project.
So I just want to say that I think that everybody in the room will agree with you. We should not be using end-of-life software. Everybody here, nobody does, especially not my company. We don't have any Rail 6 anywhere in our environment. But outside of this room, I think we can all agree that there are some applications that only run on Rail 6 or 4 or 5, and the business has been relying on them. They're business critical applications for reasons. Why they haven't been upgraded, above my pay grade. The question really boils down to when the business does have that necessity, we do need Rel 4 for whatever reason, because this application. What is the solution? Because the business needs have to come first. And when it comes to a patch that is exploitable on Rel 4, what should we be doing?
That's where you got to build your moat around those systems, right? You have to put every mitigation, compensating control, every technology that keeps that thing from being accessible to an attacker. You have to do that. But then now you have to weigh your own risk, right? Is it the risk of exploitation? Or is it the risk of I have to now spend a bunch of money to upgrade an application or buy something else, do a migration, all of these, like either one is risk, right? So one is like, we accept that risk. We know about it. We can pay attention to things that may or may not affect it. And we can build compensating controls around that to protect it as much as possible. But we accept that the risk of this being exploited is less than the risk of having to do this costly, expensive, difficult, maybe impossible migration. And I mean, that's a business decision.
Agreed, 100%. Second question is, I know you mentioned that only like 0.26% of all CVEs in Red Hat were exploited, something to that.
Mhm.
I agree with you, but you only know of 0.26. Just going by the same example of the proprietary vulnerabilities, we don't always know, hey, maybe there is one that it's not openly available. Maybe some nation state does have it. Some ransomware gang does have it, and they're going to try to take advantage of it. So while I do agree with you, yes, very few vulnerabilities are actually actively exploited by script kiddies. It kind of becomes a very naive look saying, well, we only need to worry about the ones that are being exploited, because just because you don't know that they're being exploited doesn't mean somebody cannot exploit that and compromise your system.
Right. But we don't just fix vulnerabilities that we know are exploited.
No,
Right. So we proactively fix the criticals and importance because those are the ones easy to exploit and high impact or high yield if they are exploited, right? Where we sit there and we go, we're actually introducing more to your earlier question, right? We're actually introducing more risk into a customer environment by making a code change for something that if it were exploited, minimal consequences, right? So again, we're doing that risk balance. We'll fix the criticals, the importance. And if we see one of these other ones that we elected not to fix, if it starts to become actively exploited, we're going to treat it like it was a critical and fix it right away. So we're absolutely taking the risk avoidance approach, but in balance, because if we release fixes, shell shock is a perfect example, right? First fix for shell shock didn't work. There had to be a second fix for shell shock. Didn't work. Had to be a third fix for shell shock. With Red Hat, we fixed it once. The original CV, not the fix of the CV that was broken or the fix of the fix that was broken, because we tested it. We did all of our enterprisey stuff to it to make sure that it was good for a end user to use. So we're balancing that risk of like, what do we introduce into your environment versus the guarantees that we made when you purchase the software for stability and like API, ABI compatibility guarantees.
Yeah, and again, everybody who uses Microsoft knows that they have 0 bugs in Microsoft, nothing in Windows at all. That's why their developers are great, but that is always the concern of, agreed, we need to test it, we need to make sure we don't break stuff. And again, this is why we always say, we should be testing in non-production. People should not be testing new fixes in production, and again, nobody in this room will do that. Elsewhere, they,
Agreed, until you have those fixes pushed on you unwittingly, and then, you know, airports can't display information, right? Yes. Thank you.
Probably the final question. It's also from Discord. Most compliance requirements are pretty much black and white in terms of fixing CVEs and not driven by risk. Considering it's very hard, impractical to do CVE risk assessment at scale, only option is fixing the CVE or getting rid of the dependency to meet the compliance requirement. So the question is, what do you propose as a fair and sensible solution here?
Well, I don't think compliance requirements are black and white, right? A lot of it is how it is interpreted. And so if I look at something like, you know, FedRAMP, PCI, whatever it is, right? It will say, use a risk management voodoo, but they don't define what the voodoo is, right? In fact, PCI is funny because in one section it says, use risk assessment capabilities, or whatever the word is, like CVSS. So it's not saying they're use CVSS, it says like CVSS, a way of rating vulnerabilities. And then further, like 50 pages later in the document, it says fix CVSS scores 4 and above. Well, which one is it, right? Do I use something like CVSS, or do I have to fix every 4 and above? A lot of the compliance interpretation is done within a company itself, right? So it's like, in my company, get to decide how I'm going to meet with my interpretation of this compliance requirement. And usually when we have, excuse me, compliance and auditors and whatnot, they're usually internal auditors auditing against their internal standards. The question really is, why did the company choose that internal standard or that interpretation? Did they over-rotate to a point where it's very difficult and very demanding? Or do they take something that's a little bit more maybe sensible and like, let's actually look at the risk in its totality? Because right now, in a lot of cases, we look at risk in a security construct alone, and we don't consider anything else. Like if I have to fix all the things, and if it causes my kernel to crash and I'm down for a week, I don't care. I don't have security. Well, how does that make sense? Right? I mean, if I'm losing $1,000 a second on downtime, that's a lot more impactful to my business than some little low that's just sitting there going, hello, you can ignore me. Nothing to see here. I'm really boring. Right? And that's an internal interpretation of these compliance frameworks. So like that, right at time. Thank you very much.